Hi, I'm Barbara Chase, and I want to welcome you to Senior of the Month for January 2020. And I want you to meet our Senior of the Month, Sharon Sandusky.
Hi.
For January. Hi, Sharon.
Hi.
Congratulations.
Thank you so
Being
much.
Senior of the Month.
Thank you. It was a big surprise. Thank you.
It wasn't a surprise to me, though.
Oh.
I knew it was coming
well,
eventually.
Clearly, if you're doing this interview, you're in on it. So.
Well, I mean, I knew eventually we would get, we'd get you out here. Yeah.
But anyway.
Okay, Sharon. Now, what we're going to do is let our viewers get to know a little something about you.
Okay.
I've known you for a little while.
A little while,
So,
yes.
A little while, yeah.
I'd say about 10 years.
Maybe a little more than that, right?
Maybe a little more than that.
Yeah. So, we're going to start off with your birth date and/or your age.
My birth date? Well, I was born March 7th, 1940.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
And I was the first grandchild. And I had a good opportunity because, well, I had two brothers after I came along. My mother eventually divorced and had to move into the city. We lived in the country to get a job. And I wound up staying with my grandmother in the country until I was 9.
And where?
In Minnesota.
In Minnesota. That's where you were born?
Yep, that's where I was born. And I got to run wild. I got to run all over the area that I lived in. I mean, it covered 4 or 5 blocks of country. We were just off the highway. And from the age of 5, I could walk 1.5 miles up the road and play with kids I went to school with, or I could wander down toward the river and visit a friend of my grandmother's. And so I got to live kind of a free life. I used to live many of my summer days out in the orchard. I'd lay under the old plum tree and just watch the clouds go by.
Oh, that sounds relaxing.
And just, I would recite Robert Louis Stevenson's poetry while I swang in the swing that my grandfather had put in a tree for me. And it was an idyllic kind of childhood.
Sounds like it.
And unfortunately, every single thing that I have in my memory is gone now. I can't, you can't go home again.
Well, you sound like you're doing pretty good.
Yeah, I try to write stories about it.
And it sounds like you've got a big birthday coming up in a couple of months.
Yeah, everything being equal, I should turn 80. So, who knew? It's like I said, if I'd known I was going to live so long, I'd have taken better care of myself. But
that sounds familiar. But that's life.
Yep, that's life.
Okay, now, when did you come to Montclair? What were the circumstances under which
I moved to Montclair in 1977. I had been divorced, and I had moved to Denver, Colorado, where my parents were living after they retired from the military. And I had been out there for about 4.5, 5 years. And the gypsy in me started getting anxious. And I decided to move to Arizona, where my cousin lived. And before that, I decided to come and visit some friends that I knew out here. And so I came out here, and I fell in love with this town. It was so much different than it is now. Everybody was very friendly. There wasn't near the traffic there is now. When I went into a store, they were very anxious to wait on me and make sure that I found what I was looking for, and it just was exciting. I remember a friend of mine, I wanted a rocking chair. Haynes was selling out some of their furniture department, and I wanted this rocking chair they had. But I lived about 1.5 blocks from the store, but I didn't know how I was going to get the rocking chair. And he went over to the store and picked it up and carried it back to the apartment on his head, with seats sitting on top of his head. I said, "It looks like a market in a very old town." But it was
that's what the town
it reminded
was like.
me of where I grew up, and I just fell in love with the town. So that's why I stayed. I went to Arizona to visit my cousin a few times, but and see the Grand Canyon. I'd go back to the Grand Canyon in a heartbeat.
Other things.
Yeah,
you want to talk about some of those other things that you were involved in?
Well, I joined the senior advisory committee for the town, and I've always been interested in senior issues. You may sometimes don't recognize all of the hurdles that you're going to have to go through after you get to a certain age, and it's getting now so it's around 55 that you begin finding some of those hurdles that you really need to jump across or over or through in order to get what you need out of life to subsist.
And there's not always help.
And there's not always help to be very clear about what you need, and it's all in small print, which you now can't read very well. So I started reaching out and doing some things, and after the lady who was head of the advisory committee retired, a gentleman named Steve Matthews, who was a realtor here in town, took the position for a year, and he asked me to work with him. And then he left at the end of the year, and then I was chair of the committee for 3 years. And that's the point at which I said, ha, okay. And the very first seniorama, people in town have been to some of the seniораmas, and the first seniorama that I did as chair, the subject was grandparents raising grandchildren. And it was based on a little tiny article like this in the Newark Star-Ledger. And it was only 4 or 5 lines about a trip that some seniors who were raising their grandchildren in New York City through the Presbyterian Church, a building they had to house them in, had been taken to Tanzania to meet a group of seniors who are grandparents raising their grandchildren in Tanzania. Now the difference in the group, and the only real difference, was the Tanzanian group of grandparents were in that position because of the AIDS epidemic in Africa.
Oh.
In this country, in New York, it was incarceration and drug addiction. And they got together with a few of the older teenagers that they were raising with the Tanzanian grandmothers, and mostly grandmothers in Africa, and compared notes and everything. And out of that, I contacted the man who was in charge of the program in New York City for the Presbyterian Church. He came and did a keynote speak for us. We got a whole lot of information together. He brought a tape that he had made of that trip. It was just great, and we had a nice turnout.
I remember that.
Yeah, you remember that? And then the second one we did the following year was called Thinking Out of the Box. And it was all about senior housing, and rather than thinking about just a little tiny apartment or something, how we could think out of the box. And we did a lot of research on different programming being done all over the country and in the world, as a matter of fact, as to what kind of housing seniors could get, how places already standing could be retrofitted for seniors to live in. And we did a great program. We had like 90 people at that particular thing, and we had a lot of people very interested in it, and it went quite a ways with the information.
Seniorama has been very popular ever since.
Because it used to be just a kind of fall program, or spring, depending on when they decided to hold it, of vendors.
Right, it's more like a workshop when it's
it was more a workshop or two, and then all these vendors. And we turned it into something that was specific. Every Seniorama since then has had a theme.
Right.
And a specific topic, and everything is built around those topics.
Right.
And I think it's been much more agreeable to people to come to, because they know they're really going to get good information. It's not just some place they go that people are selling them something.
Right, because it's focused on something of interest
Yes.
to everyone attending.
Yes.
Okay, moving on, briefly talk about some of the life lessons that you've learned over the time.
One of the life lessons
79
I
years.
first learned, I was young. I read. I started reading at the age of 5, and there was a library truck that came from the city out to my grandmother's property, and it would pull in the driveway. It looked like a UPS truck, and it was fitted out inside like a small library. And it had these leather trunks that sat on the floor that had big belts on them, and the librarian would open them up, and I could pick out what I wanted, and I could get 10 books for the month. And after about 4 months of reading, I told the librarian there was nothing there I hadn't read, and could I get something else? And she asked my grandmother if she thought I was old enough. I was, I don't know, 6, almost 7 by then. And she agreed that I could read a Zane Grey Western. And so the librarian showed me 2 or 3 Zane Grey Westerns, and I read those. And I remember the first one I read, Wandering Caravans, I think it was called. And one of the cowboys, about the 3rd chapter, said the word damn. And I know my grandmother did not know that word was there. And I didn't tell her. But I became a big Western fan after that. And when I started traveling and went back into a main family unit when my mother remarried, and we began traveling, and it wasn't just the places we went and stayed, it was the in-betweens, it was the getting there. And I saw Mississippi. We did not have segregation in Minnesota. And I remember a gentleman I met years later telling me that he had hitchhiked from Great Lakes Naval Station to California back to his home at the end of the war. And he had gotten to Minneapolis, it was late in the evening, and he didn't know where the Negro hotels were. So he stopped a policeman and asked him where he could go to a Negro hotel, and the policeman looked at him like he had 2 heads. He said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "How much money you got? You can go to any dang hotel you want." And he was flabbergasted because that had never happened to him
You never
before.
had that experience
And that was,
before.
in Minneapolis, I did not have that experience. So when we went to Mississippi, I remember walking down the first time my mother and I went into town. I'm 9, and I'm walking on the street side from my mother. And it's crowded, it's Saturday, and it's very crowded. And there was an old black gentleman coming toward me, and he was right on my line, and I was trying to get out of his way. But I couldn't go either direction. I either had to go into the street or I had to push my mother out of my way. He got almost to me, and he stepped into the street. He was almost hit by a car. And I just stopped right in my tracks, and I said to my mother, "Why did he do that?" And she said, "We'll discuss it at home." And and we did. And I couldn't believe that.
Did you develop your mantra out of these experiences? Tell me your mantra.
Well, I think I said in the paper that it's kind of like, if it doesn't matter now, it doesn't. If it doesn't matter in 80 years, it won't matter now. And that's basically what I came to believe. Anything that's really important, anything that is part of what you would call mankind's necessity to live, outlasts him. And it's always there for everybody who comes along.
In other words, it was always important.
It was always, yeah.
And it's still important.
It's like being nice to each other, treating each other nice has always been something that was important. Being able to survive and live sufficiently, you didn't have to be wealthy or anything, but being able to have enough food and a roof over your head is always a necessity.
Always.
It doesn't matter who you are or where you are.
Well, I learned a lot about what you think and how you feel, and I think that our viewers will have a lot to think about.
Well, I appreciate the recognition, and I thank you.
Brought up a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Senior of the Month, Sharon Sandusky, January 2020.